for the people that don't know Pete Tinney, born in 1938, many moons ago, in Stone Allerton, and you moved to this area in 1950, which is with your family.
Yes.
And farming goes back 2-3 generations. Dad was a farmer, grandfather was a farmer. Now, when you were watching that film, Pete, set in 1940 in Dorset, what were you thinking in terms of your own sort of memories? I know you were a little nipper during the 1940s, but what kind of memories came to mind for you?
Well, some of the things were very familiar from the fact that I sort of became conscious, I suppose, of what you call it, from 1947, whatever, 9 years old, and then particularly when we moved to Limekiln Farm in 1950. And my father, not very big farmer, it's a tenant farm, Limekiln Farm, where Margaret and I still live, but we hand milked. And in fact, when I left school in 1953, the only thing I wanted to do, really, I had a secondary modern education, very secondary and not very modern. And all I wanted to do, really, was to come home and farm with my father, because I thought that was going to be easy.
And when you left school in 1953 on that Friday, you couldn't wait to join your dad, could you? And then on the Monday, Tuesday, what were your thoughts about farming when the reality hit?
Well, Father said, you start work on Monday, and I started work on Monday, and Tuesday I began to think I might have made a mistake.
How hard was it? What was the reality like?
Well, the realities basically were just like it's shown here on the film, because they were all, we were hand milking, and I'm not exactly proud, but I'm proud to say that I hand milked from 1953 when I left school until 1961. We hand milked all the cows. We didn't have a milking machine. And I suppose the biggest thing with that from a start off was the tie. That's what we always call it, or it's always known as, it's a tie, because you have to milk cows, as it said, twice a day. And I was never very good at getting up in the morning. And
what time did you have to get up to do the morning milking?
Well, I was supposed to get up at 6:30, but my father used to call up the stairs and say, Pete, come on. And then he used to go down in the kitchen and make some tea. And I used to put one foot out of bed and go like that, so that he'd think I was walking about.
And you were still there lying in bed?
I was still there lying in bed, yeah. So that was just one of those things. But it was, as I said, we hand milked. Yes, and I mean, the things that we show there were so typical of that time. It was all hand work. I mean, to us, because we didn't know anything else. I don't mean we didn't know that things were improving, but you just took it for granted. You had to do it.
What was interesting about that film, 1940s, it was still, mechanisation was beginning to come in. Now, I know with your dad, he wasn't a fan. So what was it like for you? Because I know you still had horses.
Well, I mean, yeah, we didn't have a tractor. We had 2 horses. And, one was a really good, big, broad, she was a mare called Blackbird, and she was a lovely horse, beautiful tempered. The other one wouldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding, but she, and you couldn't catch her in the morning anyway. So she was a bit of a liability, but I mean, we had horses. And then when I joined Young Farmers and all my peer group, and there's some of them here tonight, I'm sure, you as a young man, you get a bit embarrassed because we were still hand milking, and there were very few in the 1960s, up until what we still refer to as a cold winter. We were still hand milking in 1961, 62.
So how unusual was that then?
Well, I think we were far behind. I mean, Father wasn't backward. And I don't like blaming people when they're not here to defend themselves. But I mean, he didn't. to put it in another sort of broad way, he said, if you want a milking barrel, you can have one, but I ain't going to ask I eat milk with him. And he didn't. So he never ever milked the cows on his own. He used to come and help to get the cows in, and he was very supportive. But he said, and so in 1961, 62, we moved into a new era with a milking machine.
Yeah, you did. So in the early 60s, you started mechanising the milking.
Yeah.
And what was your dad's response, and how did you feel about it? Were you torn?
Well, no, I wouldn't. I mean, once we got used to the milking machine, and it could take all day, getting cows used to milking in a machine is not easy because they're not used to going into a machine that rattles on an engine making a noise one end. But I mean, once we got used to it, and of course it allowed you, if you had the land to farm the cows on, that you could have more cows, because I don't know, a lot of people used to boast they could milk 20 cows in a milking session and what have you, but I mean, if you milk 7 to 12 cows in the morning and in the evening, as an individual, I mean, then, I think you've done quite well. But of course, once you got to a certain stage, if you wanted to have, we'll say 15 cows, 8 and 7, you see what I mean, then you were stuck unless you got somebody else to help you, because the milk had to be got on the stand, and all these, it wasn't something you could drag out all day. So when you had a machine, then you could increase the cows and in fact reduce the time, because we could milk 4 cows at a time. We had what was very popular in this area, which lots of people recognise, was what we called a Gwillim's milking barrel, become the Somerset milking barrel. I mean, there were other companies making milking machines, which were portable metal bale with 4 or 6 sections or 2 sections in it, and you had an engine on the end which created a vacuum through a pump. And so basically, I don't know if it's exactly simple, but you could double your herd, and you didn't need to double the manpower. And in fact, you could even milk them quicker, because one man could milk, once he got used to it, 4 cows at a time. You could milk 20, 30 cows, just one person twice a day.
So this mechanisation, it leads me neatly to my next question. How do you think mechanisation changed the farming community and changed the character of farms?
Well, all over, it obviously did change the character. I don't know, I can't really sort of suggest how it all happens, but if you take, for instance, in 1950, when we went to Limekiln Farm, it's just my estimation, but I don't think it's far wrong. There was 29 farms on that estate, which I think was about 1,500 acres. I'm not exact on acreage, but there were 29 people getting a living from milk licenses. Now, basically, there are only 3 major dairy producers on that same estate, and actually with probably only about 8 full-time people, including the farmers, running it, where before there would have been 40 people. But then, of course, there was a lot more sort of interaction. There are people who help each other and sort of have groups of people that do various things, and contractors. But before, it was a different thing that you helped. There was much more integration, as it were, haymaking and all those sorts of things, that you relied on people coming in just to help you, not always paid, but it was something that they did, and then they got plenty of cider for doing it.
And you've neatly led me to the next section of this interview. Thank you for that, Peter. In terms of integration, and we had a glimpse of a very civilised social kind of night going on in the film, but I know that within this area, cider was a big thing, and making your own cider was a huge thing. Tell me about the sort of the mangolds and the flagging of ciders and a nip of cider. What was that like for the farms around here?
Well, I mean, not every single person and not everybody agreed, as it were, but if you didn't have cider, you didn't get anybody to help. Because, and I mean, if we were hacking mangles, we called it hacking. People call it hoeing and dibbling and all that, but we called it hacking. If you were hacking mangles, I mean, this is getting the weeds out, and you had 3 or 4 blokes, men helping because it's a very tedious job. And if you've got rows 100 yards long and you've got 50, 60, 70, 80 rows at 100 yards long and you've got to do it all by hand, you would need to have some encouragement, and the encouragement was to have some cider. So basically, it wasn't that they really needed it, but it was an encouragement, because you had a flagon. A flagon was those dark brown bottles. I think they held about 2 pints, I'm not quite sure. We used to call them flagons. So you take flagons out, and each man, and this is absolutely true, each man would have, if he was going to do 4 rows, he'd have a flagon of cider one end, and a flagon of cider t'other end, and you'd have a tip before you started, and then you started, and then, I mean, there were some. I knew one man, he had a flagon halfway down because he had to sharpen his hack or hoe. And then you got the other end and you say, we'll have a tip. So you have a tip, and then you turn around and come back again, and the same process. And it was the same with haymaking. And I'm sure a lot of people here would know that you went out haymaking, you had 3 or 4 people who had other jobs but were capable of manual labour, and you go in the cider house to start with and discuss what you were going to do, and have a few, and then you go out in the field and you say, you got to have a tip before you start. It was known as a tip. Have a tip. So
a tip would just be what, a couple of swigs?
It's a sip, depending on the size of your mouth, but it was, it was, you know, you had, some tips were bigger than others, but.
How big was your tip when you had a tip?
Sorry?
How big was your tip?
Well, I wasn't very, I mean, I was never a huge cider drinker. I liked it, but it didn't like me, really. But anyway, I mean, so they'd have a tip. You go out in the field, and you start doing whatever. Say you were loading hay, well, there'd be, people had secretive places. You push a bottle or a flagon on, you know, in behind the raid and what have you, and then you half load, and then you have a tip. And then you go on and another one, and you go on and you get back in the yard. You'd have to discuss who was going to go on the rick, who was going to pitch off, who was going to do it, have another tip. And 2 loads and 16 tips. You weren't really capable of doing much else.
And talking of tips and not being capable of doing much else, now I know your dad was partial to a tip or two. Tell me that wonderful story about your dad on a lady's bike and your mum with the washing and being not particularly happy.
Well, my father did, yes, he did. Mother didn't really approve too much of drinking, but father did. So, yes, he used to go to the pub quite a bit. And, yes, I can remember my mother working so hard that, you know, she used to do the washing by hand, sheets, and she used to wring it all out with her by hand and all that, and it was a really hard job. And my father would say he was going down to see if there was any grass growing in a field. Well, there's 1,400 acres of grass growing in the field around. But anyway, he'd end up in the Sex's Arms or something like that. And about 2 o'clock, because there was a whole raft of families, particularly wives, who would lay the dinner at 1 o'clock, and then sharp, had to be at 1 o'clock, couldn't be 5 past or 10 to, but it was 1 o'clock, and then there'd be nobody there to eat it, would there? See? So they'd sit there and fester like that until 2 o'clock when they came home, and then there'd be an altercation. But my father used to like to go down to Sex's Arms, but as he was getting older, and if you've had 3 or 4 or 5 pints of beer or whatever, some cider probably, up Bill Walls or somewhere like that, so he took to having a lady's bicycle, because it's easier to get on a lady's bicycle if you've had 6 pints of cider than it is a man's bike. And my mother had done all that work, and she was scrubbing the back pavement, because with the suddy water you had from hand washing, I don't think we were a dirty family, but it would be sort of grey, because the milking coats and the spans, and sometimes you had to scrub the stools, didn't you, as well, and all that sort of thing. So the water would be sort of greyish brown. And there's always bits in the bottom of you scrub any surface outside, it's like sort of carrot in the sick. There's always carrot in sick, isn't there? So there's always pebbles in the bottom of a bucket. Anyway, father came back after about 16 pints or whatever, And he came in, and Mother was furious because she'd been doing all that work all morning, and he'd been down to Sex's Arms. And, he'd been discussing business, mind, but it was... And he came in, and he walked across to her, and my father never fell about, and you never really... But his alcohol content was judged by his bottom lip used to sort of quiver like that. And he walked across to my mother, and she was seething, really. She was absolutely seething. And he put his head right against her shoulder, and he breathed out. And she went, like that. And he said the most romantic thing that any man has ever said to any woman after she'd been working for 6 hours, and he'd been down the pub and had about 8 pints of beer. Because he said, "Shall I sing you a song?" And she went black. And she said, if you do, she said, "I'll throw this water over you." And he told me years later he never intended to sing, but he moved his lips. And she picked up the bucket and she tipped right over the top of his head. And all these bits ran down inside his trousers and out the bottom. And then he disappeared, and we had to go and look for him at 6 o'clock. That was really what happened, yeah, basically.
Pete, we could go on, well, for the whole week, I think, but we're going to have to leave it there. For anybody who's got any questions for Pete, there will be a question and answer session at the end of the show, so please stick around if you do want to hear some more from Pete and ask him questions. So for the time being, thank you, Pete.